If your ink's too slow and your nib won't flow, here's one of the places that you can go. Larry is here to see you through with Mr. Announcer and Cubby too. It's Larry's Fountain Pen Reviews.
So, let me introduce Mike. Is back with us on Zoom. Yay!
Hello, everybody.
And then we have the marvelous. So I'm going to turn the microphone over to Doc Joe because he'll shut me out anyway. So anyway, Doc Joe, it's all yours, and Mike. Take it away.
Yeah, Michael and I had some conversations about tonight, and he's set up to do some demonstrations, and I gave him a few topics that we can cover. I think that would be important to people who are, fountain pen people, are interested in penmanship. Obviously, Mike's got incredible skill with the pen, and but what I want to maybe start off with, Michael, the work that you do, that ornamental stuff. Now, if we leave the shading aside, how does that translate into somebody using a fountain pen?
I mean, honestly, all of the designs that I create, any of the work that I do, specimens I create, or signatures I design for people, can be done without the flourishes. The main difference is you lose a little bit of the contrast, like the thick and thins, but matter of opinion, guaranteed there are some beautifully flourished monoline thin designs out there that the old guys did that people nowadays do. I mean, monoline calligraphy is nothing new, and it looks gorgeous. I personally like the shades and whatnot, so that's the style of ornamental penmanship that I lean towards. But perfect example is anytime I do, I was going to see if I have one close by, but I don't. Anytime like I sell prints of my work, when I sign them, I don't dip those, but I use the same ornamental signature that I use with my dip pen with a fountain pen or a pencil or sometimes a ballpoint, but usually it's just in pencil, or I'll use one of my fountain pens.
Yeah, I learned that the hard way early on with the earliest Iamphith conventions. At the point where people wanted my signature, they would come up with this different paper, and you'd go to use your dip pen, and all of a sudden there's ink bleeding into everywhere. So, yeah, exactly.
If the person handing you the paper hasn't assured you or doesn't know like how McCaffrey's or Iron Gall ink or something is whatever you're using is going to work. Because that's the thing too. There's in the dip world, like on my desk right now, I have 4 jars of different inks right here. And there's about 10 more right over back here. So you never really know, because walnut's not going to act the same as like an Iron Gall, or there are certain like Arnold's writing fluid. Back in the day, certain papers, it will oxidize to a beautiful dark black. Other papers, randomly, I have a vintage typewriter paper that I use every once in a while when I really want to get a vintagey type of feel. But some of my vintage inspired Iron Gall inks, they don't blacken at all. Like they stay super light gray, which is really weird because on, say, Rhodia or other Clairefontaine papers, or even just printer paper, bleeds, but they'll darken. So it's always different. So you never know.
And just for clarity's sake, you're talking to fountain pen folks here, and so you're talking about inks that are dip pen.
Yes, and dip pen only inks.
Right. And so when you think about the ability, let's just talk for a minute about ink thickness or viscosity. Okay, so there's actually variance even in the fountain pen world of this. Some people talk about a wetter ink versus a drier ink. And so when you talk about dip pen inks, could you have an ink that's too thin or too thick?
Oh, for sure.
I'm leading questions here, so yeah.
I mean, I think definitely that sometimes some of the dip pen inks that I've used in the past, they confuse me sometimes. Because as a perfect example, like a thin ink, you would imagine super thin ink, super nice, because it's going to go down. You're going to get super fine hairlines. It's going to flow out of the pen fast enough. Because as you guys, I write quite quickly, as some of you may know. So you need to have a flowing ink, but it's really easy. It's like a slippery slope, or you take one step too far into the too thin, and then like what can happen in fountain pens sometimes as well, you get blobs of ink that if you, as you're moving, just like not gravitational force, but movement is going to pull ink off of the nib and onto the page. So then you get blobs and stuff like that. And I believe that different penmen, and this is just like how different fountain pen users like different inks, like you talk about wetter inks, drier inks. Some people think that's a myth and they're all the same.
Right.
Personally, there's a huge difference.
Yep.
Like I went on a mission years ago to find what was for me the driest fountain pen black ink, because I like the finest of ridiculously fine lines. And if my ink is wet at all, I mean, all ink is wet, but if there's a possibility to have a drier ink that's fountain pen friendly, that's going to give me a better result than a wetter ink. So I'm specific in the fountain pen ink that I use when I'm using, I have a number of pens that have like super extra fine ground points and whatnot. If I was using a broad nib, it's not as big of not nearly as big of a factor.
Give me 1 second. I'm sorry to mute this.
Oh no, you're
Hello?
good. Going back to what I mentioned earlier about how it's also interesting with different inks. I believe it was Chris Yoke, who runs the Yoke Pen Company, he makes dip pens, and for a while he made some small batch vintage inspired, using vintage recipes, iron gall inks, so dip pen inks. And there was one, which I believe it was his Mataraz ink, which Mataraz was a famous penman from the 1800s. And this ink was either his Mataraz ink or his Japan ink. And it was very confusing to me, because when I would look at the ink or dip in the ink, it seemed crazy thick. Like it looked like I just dipped in, and you could say out loud, well, I'm not going to like this. I mean, after using a number of inks over a lot of years, you get an idea. Like you dip in, even in a little bit of a swirl, you see how the ink sits on the nib. And you can kind of decide if this is going to be good, or if it needs more water, or if it needs more something else. But this ink was super thick to the point where I didn't think it would work at all. And it would flow amazingly fast out of the pen. And it's to this day, it's the most confusing ink I've ever used, because it doesn't look like it should work. It looks like it's just no good, and I should just throw it, like it's gunked up and I should throw it in the garbage. But it writes beautifully. So it's very confusing.
By the way, guys, sorry about that. I'm expecting an important delivery from DHL. I have a custom coffee grinder coming for me. And they're almost here, so I have to get up and take the delivery. But anyway, so Michael, do me a favor real quick. Talk about, if I use your ink and you get a really fine line, and I use the same pen, but I write slowly, can I get a thinner line?
No.
Why not?
I mean, the momentum or the speed that drives the pen. I mean, you can take any fountain pen, and take any Pilot, Sailor, you name it, even with fountain pen ink. If you write slow versus if you go really whipping fast, the fast line is going to be a finer line always. That's a, I think, scientific constant. When you write slow, there's more time for more ink to go down on the page. So there is the part that penmen will consider is like fluidity of line. So if we take the ink out of it, the lines are going to be smoother and whatnot. But when it's just capillary action or gravity that's just feeding as the nib is touching the paper. So naturally, the longer I take, the longer or the more ink can fall off of the nib or be pulled off of the nib onto the paper. So with that being thought of, the faster I go, the less ink has time to go down onto the paper, so the finer line I can make, which makes us think, in theory, if I could always write wicked fast, my writing will always be the finest. Which is why you'll see fountain pen, dip pen, doesn't matter. A capital stroke will, I think 9 times out of 10, a capital letter will have nicer hairlines, even in the vintage specimens, than a lowercase letter, because they would go faster. There's more arm movement. The whole body was kind of coming into play, versus lowercase. There's still movement, but it's not as whipped as fast. So there is and it is slight, like you got a magnifying glass to see it sometimes, but there is a difference. I definitely know when I write, huge difference between my capitals and my lowercase letters, which is very frustrating. I wish my lowercase hairlines would look like my capital hairlines, but that's, those are one of my targets that I strive to achieve one day, and why I practice as much as I do.
Before I ask Michael more questions, does anybody have questions for him at this point?
Yeah,
Larry.
Go back a little bit on the dip pen inks. Is there a difference between those and the regular inks? What?
Honestly, if you want to talk about like the chemical makeup of iron gall inks, you could probably get into it more. There's a major difference in the two inks. Joe can probably explain it better than I can.
Well, okay,
Yeah.
let me talk about that.
Go ahead, Larry.
So the iron, we're going to talk about iron gall ink for calligraphy, and we're going to compare it. Let's check out a diamond ink. Big difference?
Oh yeah, the formulations are different. A lot of fountain pen inks are based on organic dyes, not iron gall inks, but a lot of them are like the Pelican 4001, which means they're fugitive in sunlight. And so there are differences, Larry. A lot of them have thickening agents that may or may not be gum arabic. You got to be careful. Some people like to thicken their inks up if you're doing dip pen work, but you got to be careful. You put the wrong thickening agent in there, and it could be a real problem. So iron gall ink is basically at its purest form. It's almost watercolor. I mean, there's no color to it. They basically will add aniline dye or some type of dye to it to give it some ability to see as you're writing it. But when you write with Blots, I think, has a more transparent. It's transparent.
Blots is the most aggressive of the iron gall inks.
Yes, and by definition, it has to be very acidic, because the pigment is not formed before you write. There's iron, there's what they call ferrotannate, an iron, that's a pigment, but they have ferrous oxide or something in there, plus the tannic acid or an acid. Usually it could be everything from sulfuric acid to lemon juice. And as you write and the air dries in the air, the metal oxide pigment forms, and that's insoluble. And so whenever you look at, and Michael will tell you this, you pick up some of these iron gall inks that are meant for dip pens, there's sludge in the bottom. You never want to stir that sludge because it's not conducive to writing well. You decant it and then maybe put a little bit more acid in there. But yeah, so there are different.
Bottom of that would all be sludge.
Yeah.
Problem.
And E.W. Bloser wrote an article on that, Larry, and he said that, decant off the fluid, put a little bit of fresh ink in there, but make sure you put a few drops of lemon or something in there. Because I once pH'd it in my lab. That means take it from acidic up to a neutral. Everything crashed out of solution. I was left with like essentially, water. It was pretty startling to see it. So, but yeah, and I know people use it in fountain pens. They're ones formulated for fountain pens. I don't know. People that could use it, God bless them. But for me, I don't put that even the fountain.
I don't see. There's not really a reason it wouldn't work. It's just. It'll work once really, really well.
Yeah, exactly.
It'll go through the cleaning that comes after it is way too much work. Like if you want to use iron gall ink in a fountain pen, even like walnut ink is way less damaging than iron gall ink. And you could use that, but it also separates and you get particulates and whatnot. So as it's in the fountain pen, it's going to separate and then it's going to gum up feeds and things like that. There's just a lot more sort of working parts in a fountain pen that it can mess up. But if you want to put it in there, use the pen and then clean it out right afterwards. Kind of like how shimmer inks work. They work, but there's always a possibility that they're going to potentially mess up something inside. They're just not designed to be in a pen.
I'm going to share a quick image of a vintage fountain pen nib. The top image is the new nib. The bottom one is after it's been cycled through iron gall inks. And what you're seeing is acid eroded damage on the nib. And eventually this nib fractured because it had acid-induced fatigue or brittleness after a while. And so, yeah, but fountain pens that are made of gold or stainless steel, probably okay. But I think in those pens that are meant for flex writing and you can take the nib out and wash the feed in the nib, you're probably okay. But I would just, I like using iron gold inks for calligraphy, but with dip pens, but just be careful. Anybody who wants to use, again, there are people who may argue with me about fountain pens and that, but certainly not the formulation is meant for dip pens.
It's just not worth it at the end of the day, unfortunately.
So Michael, you talked about speed. I think I texted you this earlier before we got on, but say something about control speed versus uncontrolled speed. And also when I see novices do this, I see people accelerate real quickly, you know, and when I watch you write or John DeColabis, anybody who's got that ability, I don't see speed for speed's sake.
That's one of the big, like I'm in the middle of with the Society of Scribes in New York. I have tomorrow is my last class. I've been working with them for a month now doing the art of movement writing, which is essentially a speed-based or movement-driven writing class. The way that the old ornamental penmen back in the day, they use speed. But like you say, it is very, very, very common that new penmen, even fountain pen users, people think that people like myself go fast to go fast, or that if we don't go fast, it's not possible. So in recent years, I use the term movement more than I use the term speed, because when I use the term movement,
right,
students will inquire, like, what does that mean? What do you mean movement? And then I can explain that. But if I say speed, nobody asks what I mean by speed because everybody knows what speed means. So students will just go fast. But it's not about going fast. And all of our bodies are built different. So what I can do is a demonstration here. Let me switch my camera. I'll see if I can get a little bit of a demo going on. Get some focus. I should be able to do, hopefully the camera shows it good enough, just sort of 3 examples. I will use a fountain pen. If this doesn't show the difference enough, I'll do a dip pen. There's my my Pro Gear, which I acquired recently. So if we think of like really, really fast, if I do a super wicked fast line, like that shows me the thinnest possible line that this nib can create. So this is what I was talking about earlier with the capital letters, because they can do those really wicked and fast. A lot of times that's where you see the thinnest possible line. Now, working at that speed, I can't possibly control that at that speed. If I were to do a slow line, not only is it going to be much thicker with the same pen.
That's an EF nib, right, Michael?
Yes.
Yeah, it's a great demonstration.
Yeah, so you can see like crazy difference between these two. Same nib. So this is going slow, and you'll notice 2 things that Joe and I mentioned earlier. The first of which is obviously the line is much thicker because there's more time for the ink to be pulled out of the feed and onto the page. The second thing you notice is they're small, but you see all these little waveries in the line. If I could write slow and smooth, I would. But I only write fast, not because I want to write fast, but the only way to acquire the line I want is to write fast. Now, if you find this middle ground, like the speed at which I did this first stroke is way too fast to even imagine having any control of what I'm doing. It's too quick. There's a point in writing a line where I can go, maybe not as slow as I did this one, but I can do this, which is not very different from the top one, but it's much slower. Like the first one was very fast. Second one is smooth. They are the same. So when Joe talks about controlled movement, this is controlled movement. I've hit a point where my line can't get any better by going faster. So adding speed on top of that's for my body and for my current combination of paper and nibs, and we can get into more of that sort of thing later. But I've reached the speed at which is nice and controlled. Any slower and my hairline gets thicker or wavery. Any faster, I just can't control it. And there's no benefit. There's no benefit to going faster other than if people watch, they'll be impressed. But
Michael, one of the things I demonstrate this when I do the offhand flourish quill and things like that. What you need to notice about what he just did is he was not using finger movement for these speedered upstrokes. he's pivoting off his forearm. The hand is locked.
Yeah.
So this is not finger movement. So I can do that when I'm doing some kinds of flourishes, but if you see me write letters, I slow down. And that means I can have subject to quivers and things like that. But he did not do any of those. Well, maybe the first one did with some finger movement, but the second
Definitely
one,
on this one had some, yeah.
right? That's what I meant. Yeah. So, but it's an arcing of the hand that's pivoting off the desk with the forearm.
Which is why. So when we go back to like finger movement, essentially this is more drawing versus a dashed movement. If we're doing lowercase letters, this is where the majority of penman's, I think, training comes into play. Is it's difficult to do, say, the lowercase letters without using finger movement. It's very difficult because they're small, so they require a lot of control. Like you can finger move, like I can use finger movement to write a word.
Right.
If I were to write Larry, super, to me anyways, I see super wavery lines and also extremely thick to my eye. Versus, and please don't judge my writing right here, I'm not warmed up and this might not be good, but if I can't go as fast and as free as I did these lines, but if I rest my forearm, fleshy bit of my arm on the table, I can get a little bit of slight movement. Again, you notice my fingers aren't doing it, so there's none of that waveriness. It's coming from the same place as when I did those long strokes, but then I can get an L. Right.
You can see the difference in the lines already.
Like, yeah, and it's obviously I wrote it a different size, and unfortunately, accidentally I did a different Y. My apologies. But the line is slightly thinner. Slightly. It like this line still isn't as good as this line because I can't write my lowercase letters that fast. There are penmen who've studied business penmanship for a long time that can. I will admittedly say I write way better with a dip pen, even going crazy fast, crazy slow. I'm not good with writing with a fountain pen as much. And I find that because of, well, specifically this one, the extra fine nib, is it skates so smooth.
Right.
And for me, I'm used to like a nail that is going to risk digging into the paper at any second. So that feedback that the paper gives me, that I don't know, that slows me down and helps. Whereas when I'm skating, I skate out of control when I use fountain pens that aren't crazy, crazy, crazy extra fine. It's not it's just when I can skate and free, I have trouble controlling that. And that's just in my own practice. I haven't practiced it enough.
Mike, I think some of these guys have heard me say on different occasions that I can't use glassy, smooth nibs. It's just not, and a lot of that I will admit comes from my history of copper plate with dip pens. But I need some, not a lot. I don't mean stabbing into the paper, but some feedback. Michael, do you have a dip pen handy with some ink?
I do, yes. I have.
Yeah, right. Do me a favor. Write with the word Larry. Well, you got one R. The Larry there. The same way with the dip pen with your fancy artistic or Spencerian penmanship. Just to see the contrast of it. You see, you can't see the line. This is why I've told people if you really want to get into shaded script, you got to use a dip pen. I know of no fountain pen that can do that.
The closest, I'll show you my two finest fountain pens, and they are not this. And I mean, I won't be able to do those shades because obviously these are not flexi fountain pens.
Could you zoom in on those two?
Yeah, my camera unfortunately can't go much closer. That's as close as I can get. Sorry, where my lens is set up currently. I could move my camera, but
no, it's fine. It's fine. I mean, I think everybody can get a sense, right, of how fine that last Larry was, even with the shading down there. And so, and then Michael, if you could execute a capital M in artistic penmanship with your dip pen, and then also with your fountain pen, please.
I just want to show an example real quick. So this, not quite as fine as that, but this is my extra fine Mike Masuyama vanishing point.
Yes.
Which this is the best I've been able to sort of acquire.
It's beautiful. I mean, it's beautiful. Just don't put any flex on the vanishing point.
No, most people, I would assume most fountain pen users would despise using that pen because it feels right to me. Like you can notice even the way I can control the letters, it's not because of the pen, it's not because of the paper, it's because of that feedback that we're talking about. The nib is fine enough that it's almost like, well, I can feel what I'm writing and I have more control. The same with this, this is my Shown Pocket 6, which might even be slightly finer.
Yeah, it's pretty darn fine.
But like I said, 90% of fountain pen users, I mean, if I gave it to somebody, it would probably come back to me broken because most people wouldn't enjoy using it and would dig into the paper. And so they are specialized for somebody with my hands, basically.
I have some Nakayas that are UEFs, ultra extra fines, and trust me, few people would like to. Don't get me wrong; it's not like I would enjoy writing page after page with that, but it has specialized function for me when I'm looking for really fine lines. And the other thing I wanted to say, a lot of fountain pen folks look at the extreme crazy hairlines you were able to get with that dip pen and think, why would you want to do this? Hard to read,
Yeah, most people don't like it. It's, as penmen, it's what we strive for because it's something that existed back in the day, and now there's, well, I mean, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but there's a handful of us that are close to doing what they could do back in the day.
Yes.
But
it's one of them. So,
that's the challenge. That's the fun, achieving the unachievable, essentially. But most people, I get it. Most people don't want to write like that. Most people writing with these two nibs wouldn't be a nice writing experience. People would likely prefer to take the extra fine of the ProGear any day. I mean, that's a beautiful nib. I have to get used to writing with it because it is very, to me, very glassy and it skates too much for me.
Michael, do me a favor. So take your dip pen, write a capital M, real fancy, with the flourish as well as the nice shaded foot, and then write it with the fountain pen, the same design.
Capital M?
Yeah. And Michael, don't screw up.
I make no promises. I'm not a performer.
Yeah, it's a hard thing.
There's an M.
It's so delicate that even if you were looking at that up close, it would be challenging. And this is the kind of stuff that excites me, guys like me and Mike. And I do the same design, Michael, if you would, without the shading. Don't break your pen.
Oh, I was going to use a fountain pen. I'll use the same pen.
No, with the fountain pen. No, with the fountain pen.
Okay.
With the fountain pen.
It's still very beautiful, very legible. Well, I mean, legibility depends on if somebody can read cursive writing or not. But this is what we were saying at the very, very beginning. Some people would probably prefer this to this potentially less flourished letter or something like that. It doesn't look bad. Like a great example would be, say, like the capital V. A capital V in, if I was writing Vancouver or something, it looks like a nice letter.
Right, exactly. The extra spaghetti, which we'll get to in a minute, can confuse a lot of folks. Yeah, that's beautiful. See, to my eye, that's absolutely gorgeous. I might be able to pull that off every once in a while, but what I want you, guys to understand is what he's able to do with this Spencerian / ornamental penmanship stuff is one of the most difficult skills to learn. It's also the first one to be lost by the old masters as they age. They can do this copper plate stuff for quite a while. I mean, Baird was able to do it into his 80s. But this stuff that, they can't do it beyond a certain point. It's the first skill to be lost for those penmen.
Our muscles degrade.
Yes. Anybody have any questions before I move on? If not, then I'll move on. We mentioned Michael's spaghetti. But before we get to spaghetti, I'd like you to comment a little bit about the rules of flourishing. And I'm going to post the image I showed you earlier of the Bodenheimer specimen. And this to me was written, this was written by A.D. Taylor, one of the finest ever ornamental penman. And what I did is I put some circles in there to show the rules that are followed to make this stuff look that beautiful. And just speak a little bit to that. I mean, besides slant angle and X height, just speak a little bit about the flourishing in the ovals.
So with, teaching the rules of ovals and signature design and whatnot and the rules of flourishing, that's one of my favorite things to teach. It's one of the things that intrigued me about penmanship and ornamental penmanship so much. So a couple of the main rules or main things you can see in this piece. Obviously, we can't always cross at exactly 90 degrees because we're using organic ovals and things like that. But you'll notice every time in this piece, two hairlines cross or a hairline crosses a shade, the connection point is very nearly 90 degrees versus being a super shallow connection, which the reason for that is if you do a shallow connection, where the two hairlines are meeting in this middle piece here, they can pool ink, but even those hairlines being so close together create what we call a hot spot. Right. And that can look like an unintentional, it'll pull the attention, where the reason we place shades where we place them is to balance a design. So we don't want heavy spots or the eye to be drawn to places we don't want them to be drawn for or drawn to. We sort of dictate how people look at the pieces we're creating. So that's the main one that I always teach first, is that when we're flourishing, as close to 90-degree crossings as you can. It's not always possible, but as close to 90 degrees. Another thing you'll notice, and Dr. Joe has shown it here, most of these ovals, or all of the ones that you've circled in red, they are horizontal ovals. So the ovals themselves can be bisected along the slant line, or sorry, along the horizontal axis. They're flat. This is something that in certain styles of flourishing, like I know there are some engrosser script and copperplate flourishers that like to flourish on an angle. So they'll use the writing slant angle, which you can see in, you didn't circle it, excuse me, circle it in red. But the oval right before the W, there is an oval that's going on the slant line there.
Right.
So to me, that I don't consider that much of the flourish. I consider that part of the letter W, sort of, because I like to flourish horizontally, and then the flourishes that are directly tied into the structure of a letter can be, and these are my own rules, can be flourished on an angle. None of these are super structured, like these are rules, you can't break them. When it comes to signature design and all that, it's all artistic choice. I mean, we're all doing what we think looks good. I can't tell somebody else what is good or bad. I can only tell them what I think looks good and what and why something may not be perceived as good. And then once people get good enough, they make their own choices. And the coolest thing about that, there was no penman back in the day, like back in A.D. Taylor's day, no penman's signatures looked like his. There are not many penman's signatures don't look like mine when I design a signature. Michael Saul, people's writing doesn't look like his writing. Everybody learning flourishing, following these guidelines. Once you keep those guides, which I guess I only talked about two of them, horizontal and then the crossing, but those are the main ones. If you abide by those, you can really do anything. Some penmen went crazy and did what myself and some others would maybe say too much, whereas other penmen kept it super, super simple and minimal. There's no rule, which is what makes it so cool, in my opinion, because you can literally do anything.
Michael, is it, and this is, again, forgive the leading questions. This is so everybody.
No, keep them coming. I like it.
So let me ask you a question. Is it possible to do everything right, but still be so over the top you have a problem with the piece?
100%.
Okay, so I'm about to flash the spaghetti image. This is one. This was an image that was done by, I think, Earl Lupfer, I believe.
It depends on what year, because this is Business Educator. It would have been the editor. So it was either, this could be Zahner or it could be Lupfer, one or the other. I mean, it even could be Bloser, depending on when it was published.
Yeah, I wish I would remember, put the date down. But you see, I mean, to most people, this might look, it's pretty letters, but look at the amount of overuse of flourishing within the content of the letter.
It's a perfect example of just because you can doesn't mean you should.
You know,
technically, sorry?
Go ahead, Michael.
Oh, I was just saying, technically, there is nothing wrong here. If a student brought this to me or somebody brought this to me, I can't, this is what I was saying earlier. There is no right or wrong.
Right.
This is not wrong. All I can do is tell this person, and this was created to illustrate this exact point. This wasn't somebody's actual piece. This was created by whoever created it to show just because you can doesn't mean you should, because it's too much.
Right.
The one rule, I guess, that what I would consider a rule that he sort of did break here, and you can see on the bottom left, there's the, and then just to the right of that, the word point. He has these hairlines going right through all of these lowercase letters at really inopportune places, whereas normally they would be able to, like, even perfect example, the last word point. The very ending flourish comes up. In a perfect world, that ending flourish would come up right between the I and the N and not touch the N. So if we were getting really nitpicky about where flourishes should go, that's that 90-degree cross, not affecting anything else. There's no hairlines close to each other. So all the piece can breathe. This piece can't breathe. There's no airiness. When somebody looks at it, they are going to be subconsciously stressed because there's too much going on. There's too many things crashing into one another. But it's following all the rules. So it's technically not wrong. It's just not as good as it potentially could be.
Choice, right? Michael, real quick before I talk about something else, talk about the ending letter, lower letter T here.
So the ending T, I personally am a huge fan of the ending T. I use it in all of my own pieces. When I do pieces for clients or things like that, I often try to get away with it, but I usually can't use it because to most people in modern society, it's not recognized as a T. If I use this 99% of the time, I would get an email back within minutes saying, you forgot to cross the T. But it's just, this was created, this was used specifically, and there are uses of it in business penmanship, which weren't used as an ending T. We call it the ending T because that's where in ornamental penmanship, it pretty much only lives at the end of a letter because you can flourish really easy off of it. Much easier than other lowercase variations of the letter or other letters. But in business penmanship, it was used because it was faster. If you use that entry stroke and you brought the overturn at the end high enough and kept it close enough to the slant, it creates sort of an illusion of a cross in that T. So they would get away with it. And people back then were used to reading it as a T. So nobody expected it or needed it to be crossed. People don't recognize it that way anymore, unfortunately.
Michael, when you set out to, I'm going to put up the Bodenheimer piece again. When you set out to do this, now people want to know, do you set out and start thinking about these circles and ovals and where you're going to put them? You know, how do you?
So, right. And I teach a whole class on this because I have a binder full of every signature I've ever designed. I think there's 2 probably or 3 of Dr. Joe's in here. There is actually right here. Larry will recognize this one if I change my camera, which exists on his leather blotter. So when I'm setting out my design process, and again, this is not the way it has to be done. Certain penmen would just do this on the fly. I'm very particular when I design things. I cannot write this way because it's too perfect. I'm not this perfect. In a perfect world, if I could wave my magic wand, I would be able to do this with movement and writing. But unfortunately, I cannot. This is my ultimate. If I had an ultimate goal in penmanship, it would be that, to be able to write what I design. So I write a very basic variation. Sorry, go ahead, Larry.
Did you do this?
I did.
Yeah, he made you got the leather blotter.
This is your leather blotter that has this on it.
I just wanted to make sure that, it looks really nice.
Well, thank you. Yes, this is the one that I designed for you.
Yeah, I know that. I was just wondering, when you did it, how hard was it to do this?
In pencil first.
Well, yeah, these are all in pencil. Like, this is a pencil design. I use pencil and eraser when I design my things. It's how difficult it is all depends on the name. Luckily, with your name, because of the B, if I just wrote your name, like if I took out all this flourishiness and fancy stuff, if I just wrote your full name, the L is at the front, Larry is shorter than your last name, but the B, because of how the flourishes come out and because I want an exit flourish, the B happens to sit right in the middle of my ending flourish and my opening flourish. So it creates a name that is rather easy to balance. So the way I do names like this or signatures like this, I write it super simple, no entry flourish or anything. I just do the simplest L into, I just write Larry, and then I write the simplest B, write your last name, no ending flourish or anything. Then from there, I sort of look at how things are spaced, how things look, because sometimes if the B wasn't in the middle, I would have to finagle some way to have the shades be balanced. And without, what I like is nothing's mirrored, like this isn't a mirror image of what's over here, but the design follows a similar pattern and creates a balanced shape. And that all comes by just a lot of erasing. Like one that would be more challenging, this one I posted recently on my Instagram. This was a wannabe penman. He wanted his sort of Instagram handle is a wannabe penman. So naturally, originally the A would go before the W, a wannabe penman. But then I have two capital letters right beside each other. And then I have this wannabe long word, and then a P, and then a long word, and then an ending flourish. So unless my ending flourish was super, super big to balance out these two shades or these two capitals that would have been over here, it's much tougher. So this one took me a lot longer to figure out. And then I decided to put the A up here to get, because wannabe penman balanced out really nice. And then I can get this AP sort of almost monogram type thing going in the middle. And sometimes like you don't get something in the middle. We get something that is like this one, very difficult again to balance. It's more so taking this sort of shape here and this sort of shape over here and making them work, because like shorter names or when I'm spending time in Asia or doing work for Asian names can be quite challenging, because we can sometimes have a super long first name and then a really short last name. So there's nothing in the middle, which has to be, that's just creativity on my part. I get to create flourishes and do, like in that Bodenheimer piece, do that stuff. And that sometimes a signature will come out of my brain in, I would say rarely do they take less than half an hour to an hour. Sometimes hours, days, I'll have to keep revisiting and figuring out how to balance something. One I'm working on right now for a client is right here. Figuring out, like you notice we have Jamie and the Y, and then I have my M and my ending flourish, but I have this large space in the middle and there's nothing that goes into that. So I'm experimenting currently with ways to fill that space, and either create a focal point or enhance the focal points on the end and have nothing in the middle. It's when there's no rule, so it's just experimenting with them. And then Joe, you've seen this one before. This is a tribute of mine to one of the greatest ornamental penmanship ever, or penmen ever, and designers. So back in the day, you guys have heard the name Zenarian College before because of the Zenarian manual. C.P. Zahner created this design, which is the Zenarian College. Difficult to read, but it is one of the most unreal designed, like just, there's no piece like it, basically. The ridiculous part to me is this, I've only found this in print like a couple of times. I feel like it was hardly ever used, maybe because it's too complicated or whatnot. So as a member of the International Association of Master Penmen, IAMPITH, I set out to create IAMPITH in a design that looks very, very similar. The main challenge for me here was using my knowledge of flourishes, but not my style of flourishes. I was pulling a lot of things from that other piece to make this balance out and look as close to, and I'll be confident that I feel like I did a pretty good job nailing how the two match each other. And you can, I don't know if the camera can see it, right above here, there's a version that is my Instagram handle, MRMG Ward. I did another one just in super light, just to see if I could make it work. But so like these things, you would start with a simple I, a simple A, a simple M, P, E, because sometimes you use a different variation of a capital letter. Because sometimes once you lay them out, you'd be like, well, those don't look good together. So you have to choose variations of capitals that work, and then decide how they work together, which is, like I said before, this is probably the main, this has been my main pursuit, designing signatures and whatnot. It's what got me into ornamental penmanship, and it's what I still push to do better or different, or to keep finding my own voice in it all the time. But it is my favorite thing to do.
It's important that what Michael says. It shows you how he does it, because sometimes people make the assumption that, he was born writing that way, or that type of design just flows out of him. And it's not. I mean, that's why I always show people my earliest work, to show them that I wasn't born to be able to write script in the copperplate style. So there's a method to learning it. And I think, fountain pens are a good access. I mean, there was a time where the schools looked at, I guess the cursive penmanship, for instance, Palmer method or Zahner-Loser method, as the gateway to ornamental penmanship, because they're very similar forms and skills. The big difference is that ornamental penmanship, the way Michael shows you with his capital N with a dip pen, that's pressure in that's penmanship in 3 dimensions. You've got the X and Y axis, which basically is typically your hairlines, not always, but hairlines. Then you've got the third dimension where you press into the paper, the Z axis. And that's what makes copperplate more challenging, but it's also what makes ornamental penmanship perhaps the most challenging. You could argue that regular Roman capitals may be the most challenging to really perfect, but
I would say it's the only one that would hold a candle to ornamental penmanship, in my opinion, would be Trajan Roman capitals. If there was a battle between the two, I think they're difficult for different reasons. But as far as I'm concerned, they're the top of the difficulty chart.
Exactly. And those would be typically penned with a broad pen, a flat chisel edge. Yeah. And so you hold it at a certain angle and you get a thick line, thin line. But thick line, thin line as you're going up in the line with the nib. But, I hope when you look at this now, you'll see whenever I taught my form of script, I always talked in terms of slant angles and ovals. People say, why do you keep talking about ovals? Because it really is.
It's all ovals.
Secret. You get a few straight lines occasionally, but it really is about ovals and paying attention to the slant angle. Do your letters come up to the X height and down to the baseline? Do they miss it? There's all these different things for people that want to get that crazy with it. I got pretty crazy for a period of time. But if you don't want to do it that way, it's fine. It's fine. Like Michael said, it's not like you just say, this stinks. You may not like it, but if somebody else may. Larry, do you want to say something?
Yeah, and I apologize of my ignorance in calligraphy. That's why I'm here, and I want to learn it. There are so many things I want to ask, but people get all freaked out. But like in the holidays come, there's a calligraphy change with Christmas, Easter, New Year's, Halloween. Does that change any, or does it all remain the same?
I wouldn't say it changes necessarily. There were penmen back in the day that found ways of, we could say, Christmasizing or Halloweenizing a piece. Like you could easily make a flourish, like any of these fast flourishes that we do. You could draw a ghost using a flourish, or you could do a snowflake in a flourish, or you could do, a wreath in a flourish. So that was sort of different penmen had different stabs at it. Sort of going back to what we were saying, once you learn the rules of flourishing, you can pretty much do anything. You can make things express different seasons or emotions or stuff with your writing if you get to a point where you can express. Because there were penmen who got quite creative with, I wouldn't say, Christmas, yes, but as far as like Halloween and stuff, I don't think I've seen specifically a Halloween ornamental penmanship piece. But there were penmen who would draw like fish and things like that. There was a certain flourish that penmen would use that would end up looking like a fish. And then there was a penman who would get colored pencils or paint and paint the fish after he was done a piece.
So you guys may have seen this before. This is a Christmas card that was sent to me by John DeColobus. And, you know, at the time when I first met John, I would consider him the best of the living ornamental penmen. And John's now, I think John's into his mid 70s now. But if you notice, this is actually a rectangular card, but it's not what you see. He drew another card on top of it and then put this little embellishment.
Yes.
Yeah, with the little and FB Courtney. Unfortunately, I don't think I have any of his cards to show, but he would take these flourishes and on top of them, he put these little like L's on ice skates skating on top of the flourish.
Good idea.
Right, and you see in a different one, John sent me, you know, this one here, if I could find it.
Little Christmas scene up in that flourish.
Yeah, exactly. It's a fun thing to do, and you know, that's where more artistic elements come in, and so you can do whatever you want. Now, could John have done all this with a fountain pen? Sure. I mean, maybe not the exact dramatic lines because you get this incredible contrast of thicks and thins, but it could be done. And you know, the way in which you can get sort of I mean, John would tell me, I don't know how you practice, Michael, but you know, he didn't go through good paper. He would go take old newspapers, take pencils and practice the movement, keep practicing. I mean, you know, Del Tisdale claimed he wore out tabletop doing this, you know, and earlier when you talked about viscosity of ink thickness, I remember in the Chicago Iampath convention, Del Tisdale, that's where I met him. He was doing flourishing, and Del was taught by one of the old masters, Leland Watkins. And, you know, Del made these huge, long pen holders, right, with these like big, like snake tails on them. And, you know, he couldn't use my ink because it was too thick. His hand was going too quick for it to flow off. And he hated the long rat tails on this. He would break them off and throw it away and use the pen holder. So it's a beautiful art form, but it you know, this led into the development of fountain pens because it's impractical to carry your ink, even though we've done it, carry our inkwells with us, you know, but if God forbid it spills or something like that. So I've been using fountain pens. And Michael, have you tried flex fountain pens?
I have. I originally got into fountain pens because of the flex writing. It was originally just I liked contraptions and I liked writing. This is way before I was a calligrapher or a penman or anything. I just liked old things and I got into them. But my draw back in the day when I got started was flex. I was the old Waterman 52s and things like that. The old super flexy, more safeties and things like that. But as I then started to train my writing, because I figured if I had nice writing tools, I should train my writing. So the first book on writing I ever discovered, just did the random Google like everybody does, found Palmer Method. I think that I found the Palmer Method book on the Iampath website. Yeah. And for probably a year or two, I used just the Iampath rare book section, not knowing that Iampath was an association or that it was anything. This is a website that has this book. I'm looking at this book and at the time, I was a full-time professional dancer. I had friends that were traveling, that were on cruise ships and stuff around the world. I was living in another country. So I used to write letters to a lot of my friends rather than emails, just because I'm Mike the weirdo and none of my friends wrote letters. So I would just be like, write me a letter. They said, you're writing so nice. I would go, well, write me a letter and I'll write you back. So I had a lot of friends, like good friends, even friends in Los Angeles. I'd meet somebody out at a bar and we'd talk and I would give them my address. Be like, oh, like, let's hang out. I'd be like, you write me a letter and then maybe we'll hang out. It's sort of like, that was the test. Be like, well, do you actually want to hang out? Write me a letter. And some people did, and it was really fun.
If you go to the Iampath website, the rare book section is still there. And I'm very proud to say I scanned many of those books myself. But it's still there. So, Larry, you going to say something?
Yeah. When I watch Doc, you and you're doing your calligraphy, or Mike, believe it or not, of course, I'm younger than both of you, but anyway, I go back to the original Christmas Carol. You might want to help me, Jake, on that year. When they write back then, to me, it looks kind of like what you guys are doing. And I have these flashbacks of seeing Joe do and you doing your thing. And that's what it goes back to. So I identify it. So in here, I want to learn to do it. So I have these thank you cards that I was trying to do this, and you'll never see them because they look atrocious.
Larry, a lot of those movies that you're talking about, they would hire calligraphers or penmen to come on and be filmed doing that. They do it even today. You know, there's oh yeah, there's a Hugh Jackman was doing something for Mont Blanc, and they hired John DeCalabas because John's a lefty as well. So is Hugh Jackman to pen stuff. So it's not always what you're seeing, but one of the dreams we have, and I'll shut up unless you guys ask questions, but one of the dreams we have at IAMPIT is maybe someday somebody will find some celluloid footage of Sainer writing or Lupfer. We've never seen that level of master write before.
10 seconds of one of them writing would teach us so much.
Yeah.
There's
exactly.
Joe mentioned earlier how we're talking about like there's the XY axis and then there's the pressure to get there is no book, there is no way anybody alive today, in my opinion, can properly explain exactly how those guys created a shade. There are many ways. And I have experimented with, you can use your index finger, you can use a gripping method with your thumb and forefinger, I can write with none of my fingers touching the pen and just use my forearm going down. There are so many different ways to do a shade. We are all, and I'm one of the teachers of ornamental penmanship, and this is one thing that I have to concede to my students. I know what works for me, but I don't know if it's how they did it, because none of us know. Nobody who taught any of us even knew, in my opinion.
I'm very careful to point that out because I had interaction, as you know, with Bill Lilly.
Yeah.
But when I came in contact with Bill, Bill was, you know, up in age, and but he was actually taught by Earl Lupfer. But see, Bill didn't do ornamental penmanship. He did, you know, engrosser script, which is what I did. And so that's an easier thing, not easy. It's an easier thing to approach because you're working with very short strokes, what they call ductus, you know, very short pen strokes versus flowing lines and rhythm. And, you know, right up the alley of a dancer. You know, some people, and I think you were telling me Paul Antonio, not a Paul Antonio, Mike Farrell or Faz.
Faz Farrell, yeah.
Yeah, and things like that, and there is something to be said. Calligraphers will talk about the dance of the pen, and there is something to be said for that. If you get into a rhythm, it doesn't mean you're necessarily moving fast if you're me, but there's a rhythm to your writing that really helps you progress. And one thing I will say is, if you have to think about the shape of the letter, you're doomed.
Yeah,
I practiced so much that I was able to make those letters probably in my sleep. So when I'm executing, I don't worry about strokes and things like that. I make the letter, period.
That's what I like about, I'm currently sort of right in the middle of a YouTube series that I'm doing every Tuesday night where I'm trying to connect every single capital letter. So week 1 was capital A, capital A, capital A to capital B, AC. So essentially making a monogram of each one. And then week 2, BA, BC, BD, and going all the way through. This past Tuesday, I think we got up to L is how far we've gotten. But what's neat about it, I mean, I've trained ridiculous hours in the letter forms, and this is the way I'm doing it in the video is not how you technically should do it, because we all teach you have to have a perfect image of what you're creating in your mind, and then you create it. I have what I consider a perfect image of the letter form, and then I'm just going, this might work for the flourishes, and letting them, because my hand follows the rules. And sometimes when you do that, you stumble upon ways or ideas that you would have never thought of if you were going slow. Be like, oh, that was almost an accident, or I got lost for a second, and then you create this extra flourish. But that only works because I've spent years, and the letter forms themselves, they're in here and they can never go away now. But it's
Larry, go ahead, but sorry.
Yeah. Another question. Back in 1938, we're going to go back when we started from on the Christmas Carol, when they were doing the calligraphy there. Why or how long did that last when the calligraphy stopped and people just started writing letters or printing letters? And why? Do people not know how to use a calligraphy? I thought it was common practice back then in 38.
Not so much calligraphy, Larry. What it was penmanship was respected and taught. As Michael said, the Palmer method, which is the first modern approach to unshaded letters meant for business writing and everyday writing. You know, in England, what we call copper plate, it was actually roundhand, English roundhand, was a system of writing, but it was a more complicated system that had shades and was written with the feather quill pen.
Okay.
In this country, yes, it's not about when calligraphy stopped. I mean, we had a problem. The typewriter contributed to some degree to the removal, to moving away from penmanship. I mean, these guys used to be paid for accountants and bookkeepers in England, even here up to some degree. But then all of a sudden we got further and further away from the need for a written form. And not so much calligraphy, just the thing like many people know what the Palmer method is, or the Zana-Bloza method. There's competing systems of the Danielian method. There's the italics, cursive italics. There are people who think that all cursive script is ridiculous. Go to italic form, and they'll actually get into wars on. I used to get into wars online about this. It's not worth it. They want to take away all forms of handwriting, and you can't continue on if your house is divided. So, we should support anything that somebody's willing to do with a pen. And so, yeah.